So, Cleve, for people who have never met you, never heard your name, how would you introduce yourself?
Uh, I'm Cleve. I hitchhiked to San Francisco when I was 17 in 1973 to join the revolution, and was mentored by Harvey Milk. Um, Lost almost everybody I knew to AIDS, and in my latest incarnation, I've been working for the last 15 years primarily as a labor organizer with the Hospitality Workers Union, Unite Here. We represent hotel workers, casino workers, food service workers. Our union is overwhelmingly people of color, immigrants, women. Think of the staffing in the hotels where you stay, the people who clean the rooms, the people who serve you food at airport concessions. That's who we represent. As you might imagine, our membership has been very devastated by the current pandemic. And I'm feeling a little bit like, really? I have to go through a second pandemic again with a Republican president in charge. It really doesn't quite seem fair. I think my friends and I should get some sort of dispensation, don't you think?
Oh my God. Well, so I mean, I've read your book. So your book, When We Rise, also was a series on ABC, but we should put the links up so people can get the book and go on this journey. So I know that your journey in part began in food service. You weren't also in service to this union. It's like this is part of your own journey. And gosh, as we actually think about it, as we were beginning to navigate a pandemic that affected so many of us, right? That is a part of our not even our history, a part of us today. This is not your first rodeo. So maybe take us back. We're gonna go back to Harvey Milk days. I imagine some people have seen the movie. If you saw the movie, Emil Hirsch, but talk about your own journey, because you were like how old, like coming of age, like in this time, like where were you in life as a person?
You know, it's amazing how much life has changed, particularly for the people we now call LGBTQ, since I first came out. And uh, I talk about it in my book that I was born into the last generation of homosexual people who many of us grew up not knowing that there were other people on the planet like us. And I had no clue. It was not something one read about in newspapers or magazines. There were no out gay people on television. One only heard about it in the context of it being sinful or sick or illegal. And in fact, it was very illegal. And one of the things I think the younger generation may not know, and especially those who are out now confronting police brutality, is that when I was young, every police department in this country had a special unit whose sole purpose was to hunt down and entrap and imprison gay people. Even here in beautiful, liberal, hip San Francisco, right through to the mid 70s, over 2,000 men were arrested and charged every year for the crime of consensual sexual behavior between adults. So uh, decriminalization was one of the first victories that I witnessed in my lifetime. But I was in high school in Phoenix, and um, I was going to kill myself. When I was 15, both my parents had some medical issues, and there were a lot of pills in the house. And I was stealing them one by one very carefully because I figured out that at some point I was going to be discovered. People were going to know what I was, and the only way out would be to kill myself. And we've made a lot of progress, but I'm sure that within a mile of where I'm sitting right now and a mile of within where you're sitting right now, there is some young queer or trans kid who doesn't think they belong, doesn't think there's going to be any joy in their life, and is preparing to end their life. So I was one of those kids. And I begin my book and end it with the statement that the movement saved my life. And that's not rhetoric, that's not hyperbole. I was going to kill myself until I read in Life magazine about something called gay liberation. And I said, no, I'm not going to kill myself. I'm going to flush these pills down the damn toilet and get the hell out of Phoenix. And so that's what I did. It was pretty grim at first. I was idiot white boy from Scottsdale with long hair and no skills and one pair of jeans and no money. So I was homeless in the Tenderloin and experienced that life for a few months before I could finally get some work and shelter. But I still remember what it was like to be hungry and homeless and to sleep in doorways and parks and to fear the police terribly. Um, but I was really lucky and I got to meet some of the most extraordinary pioneers of our community and our movement. Women like Del Martin and Phyllis Lyon, who started the first lesbian organization in the world, the Daughters of Bolitas. I met Sylvester my first night in San Francisco, and we remained friends until he passed away. And of course, I met Harvey Milk, who mentored me and encouraged me and got me to cut my hair and go back to school. Um, I wanted to be a film director, and Super 8 movie cameras had just been made somewhat affordable. And I scrimped and saved, and I bought myself a camera, and I shot this little film. And Harvey and his partner were going to have a film festival in their little camera store of Super 8s. And I showed him my little movie, and he took me aside and he said, "I'm sorry, you have absolutely no talent at all. And child, you need to change your major." And so I transferred to San Francisco State and enrolled in the political science department. And Harvey took me with him to City Hall as an intern. By the way, his little film festival, which started out with a sheet on the wall and a handful of Super 8 movies, continues today. It's now the San Francisco International LGBT Film Festival, and attended by tens of thousands of people every year, and is often the venue for the premiere of important films.
You mean the Frame Line? Frame Line?
Yeah.
That's awesome. But they're actually a partner of ours in our events out there. Frame Line. Hello. Question. And this is just my own learning. So we navigate laws today on the battle towards equity and equality. But what you're talking about is a very different experience of default criminality. Like, you're talking about aggressive policing, and that's something that people are experiencing today, right? Based on ideas. Can you maybe talk about how these early heroes, and I say early like this is ancient times, it's not ancient Rome, this is, in our lifetimes, how did they navigate when they were being so aggressively criminalized in order to find platforms? Like, long before you can run for city council, you have to navigate making it down the block as someone who is targeted to be illegal.
Well, I think probably the majority of us failed to navigate it in any way that was healthy for us. We hid. We were beaten. We were murdered. We drank ourselves to death. We committed suicide intentionally. Though that was the reality I grew up with. And it's hard to explain to young people the internal impact of being a criminal, of being, really determined by the state to be a criminal. And then when you combine that, there were no pro-gay clergy back then. There were no denominations marrying same-sex couples. So you had the legal reality that we were a criminal class. You had the religious overlay on that we were sinful and doomed to burn in hell. And also the entire medical and psychiatric and psychological hierarchies were all, it was considered an illness. It was considered a mental disorder. So we were sick, we were sinful, and we were criminal. And that really was the life of the generations that preceded mine. But even in that world, we were beginning to organize. A man named Frank Kameny in the mid-1960s began to organize regular marches on the 4th of July in Philadelphia. The Daughters of Bolitas were formed. The Mattachine Society was formed. And then in 1969, when I was 15, something happened in New York, and it's now been mythologized, and what really happened, I think, has been largely lost, but the context is very important. The cities were burning. In 1967 and 1968, the racial temperature of this country was just boiling over with rage, and block after block after block of many, many major cities, over 150 cities were burnt to the ground, and National Guard were deployed, students were shot, there were assassinations. So it was an extremely volatile time. And uh, there was also the presence of the influence of the counterculture, the hippies. And so I think that the young people that were in Manhattan then were very similar to the crew I was with in San Francisco a couple of years later, and that we were basically fleeing all the different parts of America where we couldn't be free, and trying to create something new for ourselves. But when I hear people describe the Stonewall Bar as a safe place for queer and trans people of color, I'm like, what are you talking about? That was a horrible bar. It was a mob bar, and people who went there were often extorted by the police. It was a very, very different time.
Wow. It is a different time, and we'll just talk about. So I know I'll just sort of jump around, but I
That's fine.
remember when Reagan was president, and I remember a time when HIV and AIDS weren't being discussed. Like it was something, and I was a child, but I remember, right, that it wasn't part of the public discourse. It existed in this other realm. The other realm, of course, being our lives. I mean, I maybe contextually, it's we're in such a different time now that it's hard to conceive of something so significant not being talked about or acknowledged. Though, I mean, today, I guess maybe that wouldn't surprise with our current leadership we're navigating.
Well, the image on the screen behind you right now is of the AIDS Memorial Quilt display in 1996. And every single one of those little tiny rectangles is a quilt made for a human being who lost their lives partly due or significantly due to the neglect of the Reagan administration. You can scoot back. I'd rather look at you than.
Okay, sure. Understood. Yeah.
Um, so, yes, I went to work for Harvey Milk as a student intern until he was assassinated. And then, as many of your viewers probably know, there were riots in San Francisco when his murderer got off. Basically, he was another former cop who didn't get punished the way he should have been. And there were very violent series of riots.
Hey, Cleve,
And then,
I need you to
yeah,
slow down because they don't know about the Twinkie defense. They don't know what things were actually like. Take them another layer into that journey. I know it's painful, but I mean, people need to hear because otherwise it gets smoothed over.
okay. There, Harvey Milk was a member of the San Francisco Board of Supervisors. Another member of the Board of Supervisors was named Dan White. I always say the appropriately named Dan White, who came from a sort of blue collar white neighborhood in San Francisco where there had been a lot of uh, racial issues, hatred of the hippies, the gays that were filling up San Francisco. So Dan White ran on a campaign to rid the city of social deviance. He was a petulant little man and couldn't function, and he resigned. And then he went back to our mayor, George Moscone, who was a very charismatic, liberal Italian American politician, and wanted his job back. And Mayor Moscone declined to give it back to him. And so he shot him. He killed the mayor, and then he went and he killed Harvey. I was in City Hall that day and was one of the people to find Harvey's body. Uh, Dan White went on trial, and somehow in this incredibly diverse city, which was even more diverse in the 70s than it is now due to, the reality of gentrification. But back then, this city was 18% African American, and there was an enormous LGBT population, growing Latino population, Asian populations. And somehow they managed to come up with a jury that was all white and all heterosexual. And Dan White was convicted of just manslaughter and would serve only 5 years in prison. And when the news of that hit, all hell broke loose, and we gathered in the Castro and roared down Market Street and stormed City Hall, and it was a very, very violent uprising. We burned every police car we could find. Uh, and I don't offer this as career guidance for young people, but what I was sort of blamed for the riot and had to go through a grand jury investigation. And the upshot of it was I got hired by the Speaker of the California Assembly to go and work in Sacramento. And I was assigned to the Health Committee. So it was in that capacity in June of 1981, 39 years ago, that I read in the Centers for Disease Control Morbidity and Mortality Weekly Report this very short article describing clusters of gay men in Los Angeles, San Francisco, and New York who were suffering from these rather rare conditions and whose immune systems had been destroyed. That was the summer of 1981. By the fall of 1985, almost everyone I knew was dead or dying or caring for someone who was dying. And it was just a very, very incredibly painful time. And it went on and on. And I want to caution people when you hear people making these claims that we're going to have a vaccine in 18 months or a cure is just around the corner, you know, we're still waiting for that cure for HIV. We're still waiting for that vaccine. And I'm concerned about that people may be complacent and think that that this is over. It's just beginning. This thing is just beginning, and people need to be strong and understand that.
Can you maybe talk a little bit about, I mean, I know it's sort of a broad question, about how queer people were treating each other as we navigated. So for me, like, I know I didn't come out to San Francisco till like 93, 94, which was sort of a different time. Like there was a lot of shaming around HIV and AIDS, but that was 10 years, 12 years, 13 years after what you're talking about. So could you maybe, I mean, just, I don't know, just talk about it. We don't talk about it. In fact, many people don't have people to talk to about who we were and how, you know, we were treating each other, right? There's very limited media, there's very limited people. So yeah, just talk about it. I mean,
that's an interesting question. I think that every generation of our people could do better in being kind to each other. There are a number of realities, though, that make that a very complicated issue. We are born into every color of skin. We are born into every ethnic background, every economic status, every ideology. We are born into every kind of family that exists on this planet, in every place on this planet, and always have and always will be. The only thing really on the surface of it that unites us is that we have a sexual orientation or a gender identity that is different from what the larger society deems to be normal at that moment in history. So we have and reflect within our own lives all of the divisions that fracture this larger society around us. And we tend to only really pull together during times of great peril, when people feel that their lives are absolutely in danger. You know, long before Stonewall, back in Europe, in Germany in the late 1800s, there was a man named Magnus Hirschfeld who helped organize the German homosexual emancipation movement. And this grew and became an extraordinary thing in Berlin during the time between the two world wars, the Weimar Republic. And openly homosexual people were elected to the German parliament. They built a library, and Magnus Hirschfeld remarked that there was no group of people more difficult to organize than homosexuals who felt no solidarity. And I think that this remains an issue. So then you add on to that the other part, which is that even now, there's such a strong message from the outside world that we are still sick, we are still sinners, we are still criminals. So our children grow up. I think very few of us, even now, very few queer and trans kids are growing up in a shame-free environment. And you know, it's practically a cliche, but hurt people. And there's always been a lot of that in our community. And it's painful and it's difficult for people to address. But I have always hoped and imagined that maybe because of that reality that I just described, of all the different ways we manifest and all the different families we come from, that maybe we could bring something special and unique to the world. And maybe we could be bridge builders and people who help others find common ground, so that we could all struggle together to build a better world and save our planet and restore our democracy and live with some justice and dignity.
Sure, it's super interesting. Just thinking about sort of gay as an experience, right? So there's the extrinsic experience of how people act upon us, right? The portrayals in media, the experiences with family, extrinsic things that we do share. Like there's a common thread that makes many queer people able to relate to each other. But there's also the intrinsic things that we build, right? So I will take the quilt as an example. You know what? I'll take your whole narrative of media as an example. Like you've made a point to create media and experiences that are born of you and of the people with whom you relate, that exist, right? And carry on. That has to be a conscious effort to go from idea for a quilt, from experience of quilt you grew up with to quilt on the National Mall, right? It's got to be intentional to go from book to ABC series, right? Do you find many and you talk about Hirschfeld, right? Hirschfeld, once again, like intrinsically building libraries, like building institutional social proof that we were here, right? How do you find siblings, queer siblings like you, that are building social proof that we were here?
Well, you know, I think I've always just found that there's nothing better than working with a team of people on something that matters. In my life, I have consistently and often just quite coincidentally encountered other people who share my passion for this work, who are funny and smart and give a shit. And, you know, that's the kind of people I keep around me. It keeps me sane, especially when things are bad. Right now, most of my work is with the labor movement, and I'm so grateful to be part of an organization that's taking on really big struggles and winning victories that transform people's lives. I want to be part of that. I think for queer and trans people, a big part of it is so many of us in our formative years wondered if we would ever fit in, if we ever really belonged. My grandmothers loved me dearly, but I remember the terrible fear that I felt that if they knew the truth about me, that they would reject me. And of course, they did not. They were, you know, right there. But I think almost all of us experience that to some degree. And so for our people, there is a desire to build community. People have said to me, well, why do you need gay softball leagues? You know, why do you need lesbian bowling night? Why do you? It's because we want community. We want to know that we're with people who understand us and respect us.
I want to come back to this. So you spent a lifetime building these bridges, right? Whether through like labor movements, through our own civil rights, but building specifically bridges, like living, it seems to me, like at the intersectionality of these places. What are you experiencing now in this time where you're at this intersectionality of labor, right? Which is about patriotism, social unrest around racism, and of course, it's Pride Month, right? A celebration that we do exist, right? And then all our powerful, unique identities are additive and are of value, you know, to the world. how are you navigating that during a pandemic?
Well, I will be honest. The last 3 months have been difficult for me. The last 4 months, really. Now, I kind of saw this coming. I was paying attention to what was happening in Wuhan. Um, I decided to stop traveling. My last trip was the first week of March. I was in Detroit. At that moment, there were no reported cases in the state of Michigan, and now it's been very hard hit. I isolated in the country. My partner took me up to Guerneville in Sonoma County, and I stayed there. I just returned to San Francisco 2 nights ago. So I felt lonely. And as an older person with underlying health conditions, I feel very vulnerable. Uh, my partner is extremely protective of me, for which I'm grateful. Uh, I do not want to die in a hospital surrounded by strangers. When my time is up, I want it to be peaceful passing with people who love me near. I can't imagine any more horrifying end than dying in some ward surrounded by people in spacesuits where you can't even see their faces. So I've been frightened. And also I feel I have felt very isolated and eager to be in the fray. And it is frustrating to be on the sidelines. However, I must say that it is wonderful to me how many young people have reached out to me through social media and through my labor union for sometimes for advice, sometimes just for some encouragement or practical things like what's the best way to wash tear gas out of your eyes. And uh, seeing some of the young people in my town, I know it's happening all over the country and indeed around the world, but um, seeing some of these massive protests in San Francisco led by teenagers and these young people of all colors and genders and orientations, that that excites me and brings me a lot of joy. It also causes me to reflect on, and I don't want to get in trouble saying this, but I often find that people who use the vocabulary of intersectionality in their actual practices seem very intent on dividing us increasingly into our ever more clearly defined silos of experience. And I think that's very dangerous. When we look at COVID-19 and compare it, for example, with the previous pandemic, obviously there's things that are very different. The diseases are very different. They function differently within our bodies, but there's so many parallels, and it shines a light on these existing inequalities and injustices that are exactly the same as they were when HIV/AIDS came. And of course, the fact that both diseases emerged with a Republican president in the White House who failed utterly to perceive the gravity of the situation and failed to act. So I mention that just because I want everybody to know that the damage that began with the election of Donald Trump, this is not something we're going to correct in a matter of weeks or months or years. The damage has been horrific, and we're going to all have to be very strong and endure. So I'm glad to see so many young people in the streets. I will be gladder still when they're in the streets a month from now and a month from then. And when I see people going to the polls in November and throwing that piece of shit out of the White House and doing what we need to rebuild our country. And hopefully our experience with COVID, maybe we'll learn some of the lessons finally that we didn't learn from the last time I had to go through a pandemic.
Learning, I heard your book. Part of the reason that you are with us, right, is your avid want to learn, to acquire information and be a part of learning. How do you learn today, and what sort of guidance can you give? There's younger people in this room, right, who want to have a full life, like active, impactful life, right, which you are in the middle of right now. We'll call it, we'll say you're at the end of the first quarter. right? How what guidance would you give to young people out there of how they should be learning and acquiring information and knowledge today?
Uh, you know, the technology brings basically all of humankind's accumulated knowledge right to your fingertips through one small device that fits in your pocket. But I think people are not really availing themselves of that. So setting aside all the questions of technology and how we access it, I think people need to read more. I think specifically Americans need to read more history. We don't much value history in our culture. And we are not particularly interested in anything older than 30. Um, it amazes to me. I was at just before COVID, I was at my local watering hole in the Castro and talking with a couple other old geezers that happened to drop in for a cocktail. And we were talking about how many people had died in the neighborhood. Um, and this young guy, kind of well dressed, young, attractive young man, leaned over and he said, "You know, you guys really don't need to exaggerate what happened."
Whoa, wow.
I said, "What are you talking about?" And he said, "Well, you're kind of inflating the numbers." And I said, "You know, 20,000 gay men died in this neighborhood. Do you really not know that?" And then on another occasion, I was confronted by a young person who said that uh, their generation was the first generation to ever confront the police. I'm like, what the hell are you talking about? We were burning police cars before you were born. But being serious, people need to read more, and they need to read more variety. I am a voracious reader still. I love to read everything I can get my hands on, but particularly histories and biographies. And then another part of this, though, um, is to look at who you're hanging out with. Who are you interacting with on a daily basis? And if you're a believer, who are you going to church with? When you have your dinner parties, who's coming over? And are you willing to open yourselves up to experience the lives of people who are very different from you? And this is another area where the union has really um, helped me stay strong and has given me insight into human behavior and human needs that I wouldn't have had otherwise. So I interact on a pretty much a daily basis with immigrants who have fled war or famine or political persecution. Uh, I interact with people who are struggling day to day just to pay their rent and keep food on the table for their kids. I interact every day with a very wide range of different kinds of people who are experiencing very different lives. And every interaction informs me and helps me be a better human being, I think.
That's amazing. I'm thinking two things is we're in our final minutes and I just want to give you all the time, but I want to ask a question, which is people are going to want to connect with you. Of course, they're going to buy the book, but you're here. The book is still being written. I want When We Rise too. Are you, is it on Twitter or Instagram, Facebook? What is the best way to reach out to you? Cleve Jones, you are right here. What is the best way?
I have verified accounts on Facebook and Twitter. I'm not very good at Instagram and don't use it really at all. Um, yeah, buy my book and reach out. I was pleased that you listened to the audio because it was such a total pain in the ass recording that thing, but I'm glad I did it. Um, you know, before we go, I think the main thing I want to say to any younger person that's listening is the choices you make right now really matter a lot. And it's a very dramatic time, and we're all sort of freaked out by the disease and the eruption finally against the police, this pattern that's been in place for so many generations. We're horrified by Trump, but this isn't just drama. This isn't just some kind of thing playing out on your screens. This is one of those very, very important moments in history. And I remember when I went home to see my mom after Harvey and George were shot, we stayed up late one night and drank a bottle of wine together. And I told her my stories. And my mother was very, very quiet. I knew that she was frightened for me. And then she said, you know, Cleve, you're living through one of those periods in history. And when you're old, they're going to write books and make movies about what you experienced. And so you who are young, who might be hearing these words, this is your moment. This is a challenge that is going to define you and define our country and our planet for a very long time to come. And there are lots of people out there who hope you feel powerless. And it's very urgent that you understand that you are not powerless. And every one of you has some gift, something unique inside you that you can bring to this struggle. And we're all different. We all learn things in different ways. We all express ourselves in different ways. My hope for each of you would be that you find some way to contribute to this cause, and that way brings you joy, because I love what I do. I love it. It connects me with the most wonderful people. It brings love and excitement and purpose to my life. And you need that because you got to endure. And the things that we're fighting for can't be won quickly. They're too important. So find a way to be part of this movement, a way that brings you joy and fills your life with love. And if you do that, then you can continue and endure and eventually prevail.
This is Cleve Jones, our Grand Marshal, our first GGP Pride. Cleve, thank you so much for making time with us. We're going to make more time with you in some future programming creation for sure. But just thank you for now. Thank you for today, and thank you for everything you have done and are doing. Period.
Thank you. Thank you all. Be well. Stay safe.